Okay, Gretchen, you may go ahead, or Steve, if you want to call the meeting to order.
Yes,
Okay.
I will call the meeting to order at 5:38 now. And Gretchen, can you take a roll call?
Let's see. Oh, we've got Cindy,
Yes.
Nancy, you, Helene, Joanne, Sheila.
I'm here.
Yeah.
Wait a second here. I only have. Let me just make sure I understand who's on the call.
Yes.
So I have Sheila Dravis Cosgrove. I have Cindy Samarco, Chairman Steve Grathwell, and Nancy Lyons from the committee, as well as the recording secretary, Gretchen Gerthner. I have various members of the public, including Jan Reber, Carla Miklos, Hogan Love, and Frank Sweeney on the call. Did I miss any other committee members? It's not necessary for members of the public to identify themselves, but certainly, did I miss anyone from the committee that is on the call at present? Okay, hearing none. Again, I'll just ask before Steve moves to the next, the only item on our agenda tonight, before Steve discusses that, I'd ask people to put their phones on mute if they can, just so we can eliminate any background noise that you may have that interferes with the meeting. So go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. And sort of a little related to that, if somebody does want to speak, please identify yourself when you do speak so that Gretchen can note who it is that's saying something. So today's meeting is to talk about 479 Westway and a proposal that the developer is taking to TP&Z about switching out his obligation of 2 units at Westway, 2 affordable units, to another off-site settlement that would qualify. And I'm sorry. As Mark said, there's noise in the background. That's my dog. I'm sorry. Yeah. So I first want to say that this isn't, in my mind, really a discussion about Westway or about the developer, Tantangelo. It's really more in concept, a discussion about should the town allow off-site units, and in particular whether, as it relates to like Westway, is home ownership, does it work? Or is it better to have rental units? Because I think the town needs to think about rental versus home ownership as it relates to affordable housing. And they also need to give themselves some flexibility. So we might want to prefer rental or home ownership on site, but there may be occasions when that doesn't work, and the town's got to be able to have the flexibility to make the decisions that are best for the town. So, well, just one other thing. So what's been proposed, I personally like for a lot of reasons, but I would like the committee at the end, the goal is for us to have a motion in support if the committee feels that way, or if the committee doesn't, then not in support of the concept of off-site units and maybe this particular deal. So with that said, let me turn it over to Mark so he can explain.
Okay, I'm here, everybody.
Who's here?
And who's that?
Joanne.
Oh, Joanne. Thank you, Joanne.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I couldn't find the number.
I've had that happen to me, so don't worry about it.
Thank you. And everybody, again, put yourself on mute when you're not talking so that there's no background noise. And Mark, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay. As the chairman indicated, the Planning and Zoning Commission is considering a request to modify a stipulated judgment to exchange 2 deed-restricted units as part of the Westway road development for 5 units to be similarly deed-restricted and owned, operated, and managed by Operation Hope. Should it be approved, it would result in an increase in the number of affordable units and also the amount of housing unit equivalency points that we would have towards a temporary moratorium. But this is a unusual case, has a bit of a history, so I think it would be helpful, especially for all of us on the call, to review how we got here. So the original origin of this was back in 2006 when a 16-unit development was approved for the 11-acre site off of Westway Road. The development entity at the time was Bookmark of Southport, which ultimately lost the property in foreclosure. And then there was another entity, Whitecap U.S. Fund, that was involved. You have a certain period of time, 9 years, to effectuate the project in accordance with your special permit. So 9 years from 2006 was in 2015, and as the deadline approached, Whitecap made a request to extend the special permit for another 5 years, which the Planning and Zoning Commission at that time denied. Whitecap then took an appeal of that denial to Superior Court. And in the meantime, as this case was being adjudicated, the Commission, at the Affordable Housing Committee's request, had amended our regulations, our zoning regulations, to require a 10% affordable set-aside for all developments of 10 or more units. So as the litigation proceeded, both Whitecap and the Planning and Zoning Commission entered into discussions to resolve their differences, which resulted in a stipulated judgment by which the Commission agreed to provide an extension so that they could develop the site, and Whitecap agreed to deed restrict 2 of the 16 units, or 10%, as below market rate units in accordance with the newly passed zoning regulation amendment. Westway then entered the picture as the successor owner, which purchased the property and the development rights and then proceeded to develop the project, which was completed in 2018 rather. In 2019, Westway approached the town through the Affordable Housing Committee to suggest a payment in lieu option versus providing the units on site. Now, we do have deed restrictions for 2 units, one of which is occupied, one of which is still owned by the development entity and has not been made available for either sale or rental. Planning and Zoning Commission did consider whether or not it should modify its regulations to allow for a payment in lieu option, but ultimately decided not to pursue that. The application proposal was withdrawn before the Commission actually voted on it. Subsequently now, or more recently now, Westway's come back with another proposal, which was an outgrowth of some of the conversation that took place at the meeting. One of the concerns that Commission members and members of the public had at the time when Westway was proposing a payment in lieu into the town's housing trust fund of some $600,000 was that that's great, but it doesn't actually create the units itself. It require a separate action. So one of the issues was whether or not, we could actually create the units at that time simultaneously. So other communities that do have a inclusionary zoning requirement, such as Fairfields, some communities do provide both for a payment in lieu or a unit in lieu option. The developer, or actually it's usually at the community's discretion whether or not they would entertain that, and either accept a payment in lieu, satisfaction of the developer's obligation to create units on site, or a separate proposal to create those units off site. And again, that's usually at the town's discretion or community's discretion as to whether or not it would be advantageous to do so. At this point, what is being put forth is a proposal whereby Westway, which would purchase a 3-bedroom unit in the Southport Woods condominium complex and deeded to Operation Hope with deed restriction in place, as well as to put money towards the purchase of a 4-family unit on Ardmore Street, which would allow for the creation of additional 4 units. So what planning and zoning, if they so choose, would need to do is modify the stipulated judgment that they entered into to allow for these units in lieu to be considered in exchange for eliminating the deed restriction on the 2 units at Westway. As I think Steve did provide kind of a helpful summary of what the 2 units, 2 properties that are being discussed in lieu of the 2 units at Westway. 80 Ardmore Street is a 4-family structure. It did have inspections done, which revealed for the most part it's in good shape structurally, but it does need some renovations, and we've talked to Operation Hope about replacing the siding and the roof at some point. The condominium unit in Southport Woods is a 3-bedroom unit, which was built back in 1969. It's in excellent shape. The common charges are a little bit more reasonable than what we find at Westway, but those are the 2 properties in question here. As I said, it would create 5 units. At worst, it would result in a net increase of 4.25 housing unit equivalency points over the current status quo, and perhaps as much as 9.25. And the reason for the range is, as all of you know, you have different point values depending on whether or not the unit is owned or rented, and at what income threshold it is restricted for. So we do know that the Westway road units are 2 units which are affordable to people at or below 80% of the AMI. So for a ownership unit, that produces 1 point each, and an extra quarter point for the 3-bedroom unit, for a total of 2.5. And if they were rented, it would be 1.5 points per unit, with a 0.25 bonus point for the 3-bedroom unit. So you have 2.5 to 3.5 housing unit equivalency points for those units, versus the units at Southport Condo and the Ardmore would produce 7.75 housing unit equivalency points to 12.75. And again, the reason is for the range is certainly our expectation, and based on the history, Operation Hope typically targets a lower income threshold, typically at or below 40% AMI, but currently the units are occupied. The one on Ardmore Street is occupied. So I want to be conservative here. Even if they stayed at the 80% AMI threshold, it would still increase the number of HUEP points that we could use towards a moratorium. So I'll stop here because I've probably covered way too much technical stuff in 5-10 minutes, but I'll be happy to answer questions.
So this is Steve, and so if there are any members who have questions or comments, if you could please ask your questions now or give us the comments. Thank you. And please identify yourself.
This is Cindy. I think we've been through this before, and I think the part of the issue with the Westway ownership was when there were assessments that would be against the property for improvements or whatnot, that the people in the ownership units may have a problem affording that. I think we discussed that, and it's almost, I think as was said during one of the meetings, it's almost setting them up to fail. So I think there's a
Yeah,
couple
I'm sorry,
issues going on
Cindy.
there, but
I'm sorry, Cindy. Let me just interject. This is Steve. I was told today, it's anecdotal, that the common charges have already increased about 25% at that Westway condominiums, directly to your point that you were saying.
So I think, I mean, that there's a lot of issues going on here. I mean, first of all, he didn't do what he said he was going to do. However, given the fact that this was approved before the inclusionary zoning, all of that comes into play. But I don't think you want to set people up to fail. Getting 2 units is great, but having additional units and having him actually provide them, we're getting more out of this. So I think that's a benefit. But then I also think we can't set a precedent of allowing people to just circumvent the regulation.
So this is Steve, and so if I can just comment on that last part, Cindy, this was a stipulated judgment in court, and so the parties to that settlement can freely make amendments to it, if they both agree to it. It's not inclusionary zoning, and it's not 830G. That through the court stipulation, they allowed themselves to be sort of under the influence of the inclusionary. But it's a court stipulation, and Mark went through the sort of 6 or 10-year history.
No, I do understand that, but I just think, he's got other properties that he's developing, and I don't know. There's something about it that doesn't feel right. And I understand the whole backstory and everything else, and I do think it's more beneficial to have additional units. And I think we've had this discussion before. There's just something about this whole thing that is a little unsettling.
So this is Steve again. I agree totally, except I'm trying to keep my emotions as it relates to the developer out of this, and I'm trying to look objectively as what does it do for the town? Does the town get more units, more affordable housing? And by the way, also, it's going to go to Operation Hope. That they're a really good group, and adding units and services for them is good for them also. It's good for the town. And like I said, I'm trying to keep my emotional side about the developer out of it.
Oh, I know, and I completely understand that. And I want to say that I am in favor of getting the additional units and having him work with Operation Hope. I just think going forward with, he's got an 830G development on Beach Road. I'm just saying that I have some concerns, but I do think it's more beneficial for the town to have additional units. I think it's more beneficial that he works with Operation Hope. But I just wanted, to put it out there that I have concerns about him, going forward.
And again, I agree. And, the old saying about once burnt, twice shy. But every development is kind of different. If he has a new one that's going to come before us, let's say, or before TP&Z, we'll have an opportunity to comment on that. And I expect and I hope that we will remember his history when we make those comments. Nancy, Joanne, Sheila, any comments, questions?
No, I agree with what Cindy said, but I think to have units already available versus putting some people, Operation Hope, into a $1 million facility, I don't know. I think it works.
And that was Nancy, right?
This is Joanne. That was Nancy. Okay. This is Joanne.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
My
Hi,
concern
this
with
is
this,
Helene. I just got in from a showing. I apologize. I'm late.
And Helene, we got sort of over the outlines of what's going on, and now with the asking the members of the committee to comment, sort of pro and con, or any probing questions they may have.
Yeah, and I apologize that I wasn't here for that. This is regarding Glenn Tantangelo.
Regarding Westway and swapping out units
Yeah.
off-site versus on-site. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, my only concern was, okay, so we let him off the hook for Westway, and, you know, as the way it looks, and he approaches this with, you know, another solution, but then what about Beach Road? Is that going to happen all over again? And it's somebody who doesn't sound like we can hold him to his word. So, I mean, I'm all for the Ardmore property. I think that's a win-win. You know, we do it with Glenn, and then are you saying that he pays for half of it, and then the Affordable Housing Committee Trust goes to the other half?
Well, we didn't want to get into all of the financial aspects. And Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but the condominium at Southport Woods would be deeded over, so there would be no additional expense. Ardmore, he would contribute about half, and so Operation Hope would have to come up with the other half. They've got some resources. I'm assuming that they're going to come back to us. We got that letter 2 weeks ago. And they'll ask for the trust fund to contribute, and I think that we would give that very serious consideration. There's money needed for the acquisition and for renovations, but that's what the fund is for. So, but again, it's sort of separate from this conversation.
Yeah. Okay, I got you. So I guess my question is, this deal with Glenn. Is it because we discovered that he was not living up to his requirements for the it's not 830G, the other one, you know, that he was supposed to have those 2 units,
Inclusionary zoning.
Yeah. Is that why we're doing this with him?
Well, I wouldn't want to say that. Somebody came forward.
This is Sheila.
He came forward. Yeah.
Yeah, this is Sheila. I actually want to ask both you and Mark, why is he requesting this? Why is he making this proposal? Same question as Helene is asking.
Well, Mark, let me jump in before you say something, because I was at TP&Z, I don't know, 4 months ago or 6 months ago, a year ago when this came up, and he said, you know, he was going to abide by the regulations, and in fact, he'd already done it, sold 1 unit, and he was looking at that time to give money. And I suggested that, you know, I would rather have units on site, and if I can't get that, give me units off site. Because if you give me money, I've got to go around and find a not-for-profit to develop, to own it, to run it. You know, it's better to have the units. So he knows he had to meet his obligations, and he came up with this, I think, partly based on that prior planning and zoning meeting. And so, Mark, your comments, please.
Well, look, I think it would be naive for us not to believe that this is in his interest. I don't think there's any question that he wouldn't be proposing this if this didn't work for him financially. The real question for us, and not really for us because we're simply sitting in an advisory capacity, but for planning and zoning, who is being asked to modify the stipulated judgment, is whether this is advantageous to the town. So again, when we passed the inclusionary zoning regulation, and Helene, you weren't here for my recitation of the long and sordid history of this site, but this site was actually approved for development by a former entity, which ultimately was foreclosed upon, and the successor entity sold the property and development rights to Mr. Tatangelo and Westway LLC. So in the intervening period, there was litigation brought by the prior entity over the Commission's denial of an extension request for their special permit, which was due to expire after 9 years of inactivity. And that was denied, then appealed, and to Superior Court, and then the Planning and Zoning Commission and that entity, Whitecap, entered into a stipulated judgment by which the Commission agreed to grant the extension so that they could develop the site, and Whitecap agreed to deed restrict 2 of the 16 units as below market rate units in accordance with the newly passed inclusionary zoning regulation. And then Whitecap subsequently sold the property and its development interest to Westway, Glenn Tatangelo, who built the project. So there is this bit of history behind it, and of course, this. So I can see this as kind of a unusual case, not likely to be replicated. It's clearly different from proposed development under Connecticut General Statute 830G, and I heard and I understand the reluctance here with regard to the developer and the history and the personality and the fact that he may have other applications pending. But as Steve said, I think what you have to do or at least consider is putting aside your personal feelings with regard to the developer is what Planning and Zoning Commission is being asked to do. Is that beneficial to the town? So ultimately, it does amount to taking the 2 deed restricted units at Westway, which we have restrictive covenants in place for the 4-year period, and swapping them or exchanging them for 5 units, one of which is a condo in Southport, the other is the 4-family at Ardmore. Tatangelo is not paying the full freight on the Ardmore property, and Operation Hope will have to provide for some financing for it. And I would expect, based on our conversation and some of the discussion we had at our last meeting, that they'll come back to the Commission and ask the Commission to approve or consider an allowance, some allocation to the Housing Trust Fund to provide permanent financing for the Ardmore Street property. So that's in a nutshell. Basically, we're being asked whether or not we should consider taking properties off-site, deed restricted, to satisfy the 2 units that are currently deed restricted, and whether that's beneficial to the town.
And Mark, this is Steve. Let me just add that I don't believe this is necessarily setting a, quote, precedent. I mean, it is maybe the first time the town has done it, but as Mark had just said, this is totally a one-off kind of deal. And if somebody comes in with inclusionary zoning or 830G development, they're going to have to abide by the regulations. Planning and zoning should have freedom to make some decisions, but this does not wipe away the regulations for either inclusionary zoning or 830G.
Yeah,
Hi,
this is Helene. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Helene.
No, I was just going to say I think that's a really important point, because I'm thinking I like this, and I think I would approve it if I had a vote. But I do think it's important to make note of that for future reference, if we could somehow get that in writing, that this is a one-time deal because of the unique circumstances.
Okay. This is Sheila.
And if I can, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Sheila. I'm sorry.
Joanne.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. That was really helpful. I wasn't. Now I'm really clear of the backstory, and it sounds like what's in the best interest of the town is to keep intact the legal agreement that's been made, and they have already deed restricted the 2 units. It's in a part of town that probably doesn't have any affordable units. So that's something the committee needs to consider, that we're looking to create affordable housing throughout the town, not just in very dense areas. So I'm in favor of keeping it in Southport. I don't think it does, it's not in the town's best interest to take this time to allow this, what should we call it, change, because it's very time consuming for everybody involved, and it's really a legal matter. No, I don't think it's in the town's best interest at all. I do think it sets a precedent. I think it's almost the same as in payment in lieu of. And I also think that the 2 units are already there. I'm not looking at this from a personal standpoint at all. I think we can look at it from the perspective of when would the Ardmore property even be online. That was one of my original questions just for Operation Hope. That could be months. I think well enough alone. Leave it alone and let them go on with maybe giving them some assistance on how to sell or rent the unit that they're trying to offload. If they need some technical assistance on that, I mean, that's something that we could provide. I know many sources. I know it's not easy to buy at for a person who's making 80% or less, but it's not impossible. I don't know. I think he's got, and I won't even go down that road. Like, what has he done to try to sell it or rent it? Because that's, that's a whole different story. But, it really is to keep the 2 units and then move forward separately with Operation Hope to develop Ardmore with them. That's 6 units. And unless I'm doing my math wrong, we're exchanging 6 with possibility of 6 for 5. I think that's what the number comes up to. Correct me if I'm wrong, but because I've only just received the information sent regarding the special request, I just opened it 15 minutes ago. So I'm working on this on a fly. So, but my calculation is they keep their 2 units. We work with Operation Hope. We get 4 more. That's 6. But those are my feelings on this. I leave well enough alone and let them figure out how to take care of that 1 unit, and rent it to the affordable at the correct affordable rent to an income eligible tenant or owner. So thank you.
Sheila, so this is Steve. I've got some comments, but Mark, you want to comment first?
Go ahead, Steve.
Okay. So, Sheila, I like the idea very much of having units in Southport. At the very start, someone had mentioned the setting up somebody to fail almost. And there was a concern about people getting into a complex with modest income and not being able to afford special assessments or increases in the monthly maintenance fee, which supposedly has already gone up 25%. And I do think there is that real concern in a I'll call it a luxury development. Home ownership, affordable housing has not an easy path as compared to rental. But the aspect of where it's located, part of this proposal is a 3-bedroom, 2-bath unit in Southport Woods, that when I looked at it on MLS, I talked to my friends, we'd move in there. It looked really nice. And so you've got a 3-bedroom unit in Southport in exchange, and then the possibility of 4 or maybe even 5, because I think there's some extra space within Ardmore. It's not perfect. Would I like to have the 2 units in Southport in a luxury development? Sure. Do I think it's really workable? No, not so much. I think it just there'd be complications down the road, like Mark has been dealing with at Navy Housing now for 12 years. I'm not comfortable with the developer. He's done some things and said some things, but I'm trying to keep that aside and just look at, is this a good option for the town? Not perfect, but good. Life is filled with compromises, and for me, this is a good enough solution. Get it done, move on. So those are my
comments. The only other thing, Steve, if I may, this is Mark. The only other thing I would add, perhaps, that again might provide a little bit more of the fill in a little bit more of the backstory. Initially, when Tatangelo Westway LLC had approached the town with regard to a swap, to swap units off-site for those on-site, the 2 units proposed were both in Southport. There was a single-family home in Southport, as well as the condominium unit that we're talking about. And the issue that I had with the other single-family home in Southport was it was a 2-bedroom, 1.5 bath, more than 100 years old, looked like it needed some work. And I just didn't think, the proposal was that, like is presently before the commission, the intent was to purchase these properties and then deed them to Operation Hope, who would then operate and manage the units. And my way of thinking was that despite the fact that the 2 units being proposed off-site were both in Southport, I didn't see much advantage to the town for swapping 2 units in Southport for another 2 units in Southport, certainly older units, and one that really didn't fit the operations plan for Operation Hope, and really fit within the context of what they've done previously. So I had suggested to Tatangelo and to Operation Hope that if the town were to consider this, it should be more units. There should be more units involved, and more housing unit equivalency points accrued to the town. It can't be simply a 2-for-2 swap. It needs to be something more advantageous, more beneficial from the standpoint of more units and more points, and suggested that they look for multifamily properties, of which there aren't very many really in Southport or on that side of town. So I think, I think the Ardmore Street property was something that Operation Hope had been considering, but didn't have the wherewithal to acquire it, even with our help through the Housing Trust Fund, and that's how this proposal came to be. But again, I understand the concerns. That this is really, I think committee members have really articulated both sides of the argument here.
This is Cindy. I just want to say that, I have voiced my concerns, but in the end, I do think it would be more beneficial to the town to allow the Southport Woods and Ardmore properties. I think it's beneficial to Operation Hope. I think it helps us gain more points toward the moratorium. And as we said, we don't want to set people up to fail, because then that's going to be continuous. And I just don't think it's a good idea. So I just think it's a better idea, to make that swap.
So this is Sheila. So is the deal, the deal to assist Operation Hope at Ardmore, is that in the process of almost being agreed to? Should we look at this from maybe this deal might go through, And maybe, I mean, has Southport Woods Condominium Association agreed to this? I mean, do condo associations have some play? Don't they have to
No,
get
I don't
approval
think.
from
I'm
a condo
sorry.
association?
Sheila, I don't think the condo has any say. Co-ops can discriminate by law. But condos are almost like having a separate house. If the bylaws already had something in there, which I don't think they do, but if they had something in there, then maybe that would hold some force. But I don't think that they have.
Shouldn't we find out? Shouldn't we be made aware of that? That's absolutely possible, and that just goes to the idea that when you give your grace or your blessing to something, all the details. I mean, that's just smart negotiating, right? I mean, real estate and in life. We all know that things
I agree with
don't
that,
happen
Sheila.
as they're said,
But we're trying to give it our consent overall. Some advice to planning and zoning. They make the decision. We don't. And it's, to me, it's not so much these particular units, although I think they're good, but it's the concept, because planning and zoning is going to end up negotiating with the Tangelo and agreeing or not agreeing. But do we like the idea, the concept?
I know. So my point still stands. I don't think it's in the best interest of the town, because you have to deed restrict. You can't deed restrict something that's not been bought, that's not been transferred. So if they want to transfer it and then come back and say, can we switch it? I would say, sure, that'd be great. Have a place in Southport Woods condo. That's fine. Switch one for one. Yeah, I mean, but you're asking for approval for something that's not been done yet.
I can't answer that question. This would be subject to. So there wouldn't be any exchange or any lifting of deed restrictions unless we received deed restrictions for the other properties in question. So that is part of the proposal.
Well, I think that is the only way to go.
That's independent from your other thoughts with regard to whether or not it makes sense. But I can definitely state with certainty that we will have deed restrictions for the other units that are a part of the exchange if approved.
Before the deed restriction at Westway is lifted. Yeah.
Correct.
Well, that would be a condition. Yeah, that would certainly be a condition for me. But I also think that the Affordable Housing Committee could put forth a blanket statement in general. So whether you think this is going to ever happen again, it will. Somebody will bring it up. Mm-hmm. And don't be surprised. And if it's done once, I believe it sets as a precedent, and it opens the door for somebody else to think that they can do it again. And it is time. It's time and money for this city. So those are my thoughts. But
yeah, that's a good point, Sheila. I agree with you.
This is Cindy. I think you guys have to realize that this is kind of an unusual development where they had an approval before and then after. So it's kind of unusual, and I don't think we're going to see something like this again. I think if we do, it's going to be like incredibly few. I mean, if any at all. I mean, now it's clear what a developer has to do. I think it's just a different situation, and that's the one thing that stands out for me.
But it was finalized legally. So
but you know what? It's also with the home ownership. You're setting these people up to fail. I mean, you have to realize that you're in an affordable unit. Now the assessment is going to increase. Now, what if they want to put up,
I don't disagree with
sound?
You.
Well, you don't have to agree with me, but I'm just saying.
No, I said I don't disagree with you.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
I understand. I do this for a living. I do exactly what Mark is doing.
Okay, but I'm just, you have to realize that now you're going to put people into a unit that it's supposedly affordable, but they really can't afford. So were they
But
going to get foreclosed on, and then where are they
other
going to end up?
There are other ways to subsidize a purchase. There's first-time home buyer. There's lots of ways. If you find the buyer who is eligible, and it's not easy. Don't get me wrong, but it is possible. The other option is, has anybody? 830Gs changed from rental to sale to rental all the time, and it could be rented. Has that been discussed? Maybe I missed that.
It's not an 830G development.
I know. I'm making the comparison. It happens on an 830G. There's no reason it couldn't be allowed on the inclusionary zoning as well.
If I may, I could answer both questions here, or points. This is Mark again. With the question really is not the initial acquisition cost. I mean, the initial acquisition cost of these deed-restricted units at Westway under the inclusionary zoning requirement is that people can't pay more than 30% of the applicable income guidelines. So we're talking about a purchase price in the low $200,000, and of course they would be eligible for down payment and closing cost assistance through the town through our existing programs. So that's not really the issue that Cindy's raising. It's really the carrying cost beyond that in terms of their ability to pay for those costs going forward in terms of special assessments or the like. Second,
I understand. The 830G has an allowance for that as well that we could use as an example.
And there's a little bit of interference I'm picking up, but I would say the other point that you yuck. The other point that I think you raised is the 830G piece. If I understood correctly, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought, but.
Let me just interject. Somebody has got some background noise, so please mute yourself if you're not speaking.
Yeah, I don't know if that was just background interference or what. I think Sheila was also raising the question of whether or not it could be rented. And in fact, affordability plans can be modified. And I believe this particular affordability plan for Westway did contemplate either for sale or rental. So that is an option that would be available to the developer. And I would also, I think some folks have raised whether or not how seriously he pursued, marketing these particular units. I think that's a fair point. Again, I don't know. At the end of the day, I think the choice for the Planning and Zoning Commission is whether or not what's on the table, regardless of who did what or how diligently he pursued marketing units. Is what's being proposed, is it going to be beneficial to the town such that we would agree to enter into something like this? And I hear what Sheila's saying loud and clear. She doesn't think it is. I hear others that think perhaps it is. So I'll shut up now.
So this is Steve. At some point, and this may be the point, I would like to have a motion in support of doing this, and then a second, and then we could discuss, and then a vote, if in fact the committee is so inclined.
Well, I would make a motion in support. This is Cindy.
And is there a second? Yeah.
This is Helene. I'll second it.
So we have a motion and a second, and now we can discuss, under Robert's Rules of Order, the motion.
Steve, do you want to spell out the motion, please?
Gretchen, I was hoping you had it, but in general, as a one-off, not as a change in the town's approach to the regulations, but on a one-off for this particular deal, we would encourage planning and zoning to work with the developer of Westway to replace the on-site units with off-site units similar to or exactly the same as 83 Southport Woods Road and 80 Ardmore Street. And Mark, I'll ask, does that sound right?
Sorry, I was muted, but sounds fine to me.
Okay. So there's a motion. I hope you got that, Gretchen.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Right fast.
Okay. Yeah. And so we've had a fair amount of comments, but are there any more comments or questions regarding the motion or the whole plan?
I don't know what's the appropriate time to raise this, but I did receive, because I didn't know they were going to have public comment tonight, but I did receive several comments from the public that were emailed. I think most of you were on that, if not all, but I did receive comments, written comments from Jan Reber and Carrie Mackover in support of the proposal, although they did raise some questions as well. So I just wanted to make that known.
Thank you. Okay, then we should call the question. And so those in favor, I don't know, you can raise your hand. Mark, do you think we should do a roll call, or just can we do it by voice vote?
We can do it by voice vote, and then just if those in favor or against, if I can't understand, I'll just ask you to make known your vote. That's all.
Okay. So those in favor respond by saying aye. Steve says aye.
Nancy says aye.
Do you want me to call around? Cindy, how do you say?
Oh, I made the motion, so I think I'm yes, aye.
Okay. Helene?
Joanne, aye.
Oh, Jan, okay. Helene?
Helene seconded it, so I'm aye.
Okay. Sheila?
I'm against.
Okay. Did I miss anyone?
I think that's it.
Okay. Do you have that, Gretchen?
I do.
Is there anything else, Mr. Chairman? Would you like to have Mr. Attorney Love ask his question at this time?
That would be appropriate. Attorney Love, if you have a question?
Maybe he left.
Yeah. Or Frank Sweeney, you have a question? Okay. Hearing none, then I would call the meeting over at 6:30.
6:30. All right.
Yep.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank
have
you.
a good
Okay.
rest of your evening. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. You
Okay,
too.
bye.
Good night.
Bye.